Welcome back. We're examining the way forward for Mexico as it tackles an escalating drug war and a weakened economy. US President Barack Obama visits the country a day from now to discuss these issues with his counterpart, President Felipe Calderón. I'm joined by Dr. Denise Dresser from Mexico City. She's a professor of political science at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico, and she's authored several publications on Mexican politics and social issues. And before we get back to our discussion, we have the results of our chat room poll where we asked you, what does Mexico need most from President Obama? 34% of you said end flow of weapons into Mexico. 21% of you voted for support for social programs. 3% of you see military aid as the priority. And 41% of you said a crackdown on US drug consumption. Dr. Dresser, you made some interesting points there about the institution building, and there are those who argue that it's the root cause, as you do, for a more effective battle against the drug industry. Now, I wonder, do you see anything in the claims that some people make that Mexico is heading towards being a failed state?
I think that claim is absolutely ridiculous. The terminology failed state applies to states that are truly falling apart, that have lost control of their borders, that are racked by civil war, where large swaths of the territory are controlled by enemy forces. This is clearly not the case in Mexico. I think the problem with Mexico is that it's a weak state. It's an infiltrated state at some level, and there are portions of certain states where criminality is on the rise and where violence has become part of the daily fabric of life for many Mexicans there. But I think that's very far from the reality of those states that have been classified by Foreign Policy, the journal that made the classification as failed states, places in Africa and other parts of the world that, as you can see, if you're looking behind me, is clearly not the case in Mexico City or elsewhere.
Now, it's interesting, in the past years, it seemed the Mexican government knew who it was dealing with when trying to battle the cartels, but it seems that everything's gone a little bit into a free-for-all state, and even some of the cartels are battling each other. And it seems to be quite aggressive in the way it's all happening. What's caused this fall apart and inter-cartel fighting as well?
I think that it's a byproduct of the strategy the Mexican government has used against cartels, which is to seek out the key members, trap them, extradite them, send them to the US. And what's happened is that once that has occurred, the cartels that used to be unified in a couple of large ones have been dismembered and becoming smaller structures with leaders that are fighting among themselves for control over power, turf, and territory. And many of the unwritten rules of the game that were part of drug trafficking in the 1980s and 90s no longer exist. So you see much more infighting than you used to. Also, in the past, drug traffickers used Mexico as a point of transit. And now consumption is on the rise in Mexico, and there's a struggle for control over territory here in a way that there wasn't in the past. I think the nature of the business has changed. And I think you're going to see much more of that before you see some concrete advances in terms of reining in the violence that Mexico currently faces. Many people suggest that it may get worse before it gets better.
Actually, that's an interesting point I was going to ask you. Is what you're talking about really behind the reason for the incredible escalation in the number of violent crimes that have taken place just in the last couple of years? It seems to be really on the rise.
Yes, and I think one of the reasons is that insofar as drug traffickers, their business has been threatened by the onslaught of the Mexican military. Drug traffickers have started going into other areas, developing other sources of business, such as extortions, kidnappings, and that has led to an increased level of violence as well. And until we resolve the issue of how to clean up the police force, how to create a truly effective national police force, how to get the governors on board, because this is a Republican system divided into, 31 states, in which governors feel that drug trafficking, because it is a federal offense, is something that should be left to the Calderón government. Many of the governors are members of opposition parties and feel that they don't have an incentive to collaborate with the federal government. And I think the political dysfunctionality of the system is not helping to fight a battle that really needs to be a national battle. It's not a war that we're going to win. There's not going to be a day in which we declare victory against the bad guys until and unless drugs are decriminalized in the United States, which, as I said earlier, is not going to happen probably in my lifetime.
Then what's the solution for the ailing economy? Then if the situation with the drugs is going to be an ongoing problem, what can be done to help the economy of Mexico, which really has taken a hit?
Well, I think these are somewhat separate issues. I mean, the ailing economy in Mexico is reflective of the ailing global economy. It's a reflection of how closely tied our economy is to that of the United States because of NAFTA. And I think the way in which the United States can help us is indirectly, insofar as Barack Obama's recipes to get the American economy back on track through the stimulus program, through the bank restructuring program, everything that he's announced over the last several weeks. Once that begins to have a positive effect in terms of the growth of the U.S. economy, you'll begin to see growth in the Mexican economy as well. What we need to deal with, though, is our image problem and the fact that foreign investment may be scared off by what it perceives as a situation of instability here. So I think that the long-term task for Mexico, beyond combating drug trafficking, is creating a society and a government that are perceived as places that create a climate that is positive for foreign investors who are not scared off by these claims of a failed state or things unraveling here to a point where the government is brought down, which is very far from the case today.
We have a caller on the line from Saudi Arabia. Mohammed, good to hear from you. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Riz. Yeah, I have a question of your expert. Is it possible that the form of government that we have in Mexico is not suited to the kind of population we have? Like, we don't have drug problems in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, but you have these problems both in Mexico and in Colombia. So maybe you need to involve the poor people more in the governance of the land so they get away from being involved in drugs. We see this happening even in Afghanistan as well.
All right. Mohammed, interesting point. Dr. Dresser.
Well, I think Mexico has many structural problems, and one of them clearly is the fact that this is a country with 40 million people who live in poverty. So it's not a surprise that over 500,000 of them are involved in some way, shape, or form with drug trafficking as the only means to survival. This is a problem that we've been dragging around for decades, and it's closely related to very mediocre economic growth and to an economy and an economy that is too high, that is oligopolistic, that is controlled by too many monopolies in key sectors such as energy, telecoms, transportation, infrastructure. So something needs to change in those areas so that the economy can become much more competitive, dynamic, and will grow at a much faster pace, and that the rising tide will lift the boats of those 40 million Mexicans who live in poverty. Insofar as we're not able to address the issue of growth and therefore of equality, I think Mexico is, as your caller said, a fertile terrain for drug traffickers who can provide a way for Mexicans to make a living in a country that to this day has very little social mobility.
Well, Dr. Dresser, with about a minute to go, I wonder if you see the President Obama visit as a potential turning point, as perhaps a watershed for how things might change.
Well, my expectations are not particularly high in that regard. I think President Obama has his hands full with his own domestic crisis, with Iraq, with the missile that Korea has just launched, and I think that Mexico caught the Obama team by surprise, and it's trying to figure out a way of helping out a neighbor at a critical time when the U.S. doesn't have many instruments to help Mexico. I think that the Mérida initiative that is going to provide, what is it, $700 million of military aid over the next couple of years is a small amount compared to the dimension of the problem. So Obama will probably make some sort of speech about stopping the flow of weapons, about a strategic partnership, but I think substantively things will not change. The U.S. may try to help around the margins, but unless you see a concerted effort to deal with the issue of demand and of consumption in the U.S., we will continue to address, as I said earlier, the symptoms but not the root causes.
Dr. Denise Dresser, thank you very much for joining us. A pleasure speaking with you from Mexico City.
Thank you.
We've run out of time and have to leave it there. And thank you for being with us. On the next show, we're joined by a doctor who was in Gaza during the attacks by Israel at the end of last year. He takes us through the current health situation of people there. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.